They say the Vikings were unbeatable warriors, conquerors of the seas, men and women who lived for adventure and bloody battles. But what if I told you that the real lives of most of them had nothing to do with swords, shields, or raids? Well, the average Viking wasn't a saga hero, but a simple farmer trapped in the cold, the harsh land, and the burden of an endlessly repetitive routine. And here's the kicker: surviving back then was far more challenging than any battle, because you weren't just fighting visible enemies, but also the endless winter, silent hunger, and daily exhaustion. Believe me, waking up early to plow rocky soil could be as deadly as wielding a sword. The paradox is clear. A people remembered for their great deeds actually survived thanks to anonymous men and women who never sailed beyond the horizon. It was they, with their tasteless porridge, their rough woolen leather clothing, and their endless workdays, who kept the machinery of Viking society alive. And you'll realize something curious. Although we live surrounded by technology, comfort, and choices, there are lessons hidden in this repetitive, hard, and boring lifestyle. Lessons about discipline, patience, resilience. Lessons that can even transform the way you approach your own routine. So, as you relax, lay your head on the pillow and listen to this slow, monotonous narrative. Prepare to enter a Viking village, not as a warrior, but as a farmer. And throughout this story, you may discover that the real challenge was never the sword, but surviving another ordinary day. Before we begin, tell me here in the comments, where are you from and what time is it there now? Even in the silence of the early morning, when darkness still gripped the village, the Viking farmers were already waking. Their heavy bodies, covered in thick woolen cloaks, felt the chill seeping through the cracks in the turf house. There was no alarm clock, just habit shaped by the need to make the most of every minute of daylight. It's curious to think that many people today complain about waking up at 6 in the morning while they were already up much. This early awakening wasn't a whim, it was pure survival. The sun, especially in the Nordic lands, was slow to appear, and when it did, it soon showed signs of leaving. Taking advantage of every ray of light meant more time to prepare the soil, tend animals, and repair tools. Imagine relying on natural light for everything: reading, cooking, working. Perhaps, if you've ever experienced a power outage during the night, you've experienced a taste of this. The Vikings' awakening was accompanied by sounds that seem distant to us today. The crackling of wood burning in the central hearth, the lazy lowing of cattle, the creaking of the house's wood in the wind. It was a rustic symphony that reminded us each day that life there was made of repetitions, but also of small details that sustained the routine. There was no rush, but there was constant. And it's curious how this consistency shaped not only the body, but also the mind. Those who wake up early every day, without excuses, learn to cultivate discipline. Perhaps that's why so many modern entrepreneurs insist on morning routine. And it's no coincidence, waking up early, drinking a simple coffee, writing 3 pages in a journal, these are practices that, in a way, echo this same spirit. Of course, for Viking farmers, there was no romance in this habit. It was pure exhaustion. The cold penetrated their bones, their stomachs growled, and still they got up. There was always work waiting, and the luxury of staying in bed for 5 more minutes didn't exist. Today, who hasn't fought this battle with the alarm clock? But back then, wasting time could cost them food in winter. It's interesting to think that this simple act of waking up early, repeated every day, was the foundation of everything. It was the starting point of a life shaped by nature in limited time. But waking up early was only the first challenge, because soon after came another, even more serious issue dealing with the almost absolute dependence on the season. In the lives of Viking farmers, they didn't control time, but rather time controlled their every step. Spring, summer, autumn, and winter weren't just seasons, they were almost characters in the same story, each with its own role, moods, and demands. If spring was late, hope was delayed with it. If winter came early, it was like a sentence for many. It was curious how the cycle of the seasons shaped the mood of the entire village. In summer, there was a sense of urgency, of harvesting as much as possible before the long days shortened. In winter, silence reigned, and the sound of snowstorms reminded everyone that it was time to survive, not thrive. Today, we barely notice the seasons. We turn on the air conditioning in the heat, the heater in the cold, but for them, each change in the sky carried real weight. Their work was all tied to nature. In spring, they plowed the hard earth with simple tools, dreaming of good harvests. In summer, they harvested grain, dried fish, and stored hay for their livestock. Autumn was a mixture of gratitude and fear. They were thankful for what they had, but knew that soon the frost would claim it all. In winter, winter was the final test, the time when their preparations proved sufficient. Anyone who's ever lived in a harsh climate might understand this. I remember a trip where I had to stockpile firewood for a whole week, and the mere sight of the dwindling pile caused anxiety. Now imagine living like that every year, with no alternative, no supermarket to run to. If you ran out, this was their harsh and constant reality. The farmers knew they couldn't afford to fail. A poorly used spring could mean starvation months later, and there's a powerful lesson here. Modern life often makes us postpone responsibilities, but for them, every delay exacted an immediate price. Perhaps, if we brought some of this awareness into our daily lives, we would learn to respect time more and act with greater preparedness. But if the seasons decided almost everything, there was one point where human effort made a difference. After all, planting and harvesting wasn't enough. It was also necessary to care for the soil, the animals, and daily sustenance. And that's where agriculture, simple but vital, became the true backbone of Viking life. Back then, there were no sophisticated farming techniques, no gleaming machines to plow the land. Viking farmers relied only on their calloused hands, rudimentary tools, and the strength of their animals. Yet each grain planted carried a hope, that of feeding the family during the long, cold months that inevitably approached. It was a task that seems small in today's eyes, but it defined the difference between life and starvation. The simplicity of agriculture didn't diminish its importance. On the contrary, each harvest was celebrated as a silent victory. Imagine spending months tending a plot of land, knowing that a rainy summer or a sudden blight could destroy everything. This uncertainty made each sack of grain a treasure. Today, when we open a drawer and find rice and beans readily available, we hardly notice the privilege hidden within. The planting cycle required discipline. Plow, sow, wait, harvest, and repeat. It was a repetitive, almost hypnotic rhythm that shaped not only the bodies, but also the mindsets of the farmers. The routine taught them the patience to wait for the earth's timing, something many of us have forgotten. After all, we're used to pressing buttons and receiving immediate results. Perhaps if we planted something at home, even if it was a simple pot of herbs, we would feel that connection again. There was also a community aspect to this work. Neighbors often helped each other with the plowing or harvesting, knowing that it would be harder to manage alone. This support network strengthened the village's bond. Interestingly, even today, those who plant and harvest in cooperatives share this same spirit of solidarity. It's as if the need to share efforts were an invisible thread that runs through the centuries. The simplicity of Viking agriculture also demonstrated a form of humility before nature. They didn't seek to completely dominate the land, but to coexist with it. They respected the soil, the rain, and the sun, knowing that each of these elements had power over the harvest. This vision, in a way, contrasts with the haste of our time, in which the land is pushed to its limits in search of greater production. But of course, agriculture wasn't just about grains and vegetables. The staple food also came from animals, which needed to be raised and cared for patiently. And this is precisely where another crucial part of a Viking farmer's life comes in: the cultivation of specific cereals such as barley, rye, and oats, which provided sustenance and even fermented beverages for special occasions. Among so many possibilities, three grains reigned supreme on the tables and in the fields of Viking farmers: barley, rye, and oats. This was no coincidence. Each offered unique advantages and was better adapted to the cold climate and rocky soil of the north. Barley, for example, was the most versatile, used for both bread and the fermented drink that on special occasions brought joy to long nights. Rye, in turn, played an almost strategic role. It grew even in poor soils where other grains couldn't survive. Rye bread was dark, dense, and heavy, but also nutritious and capable of sustaining hours of work in the fields. Anyone who has tasted this type of bread knows that it isn't soft like modern breads, but it has a strong flavor, carrying within it the rusticity of the earth. It was both nourishment and a reminder of the struggle against adversity. Oats already occupied a special place in the daily routine. Transformed into a hot porridge, it was the ideal breakfast to face the cold. Imagine a steaming, simple bowl made only of cooked grains and perhaps a splash of milk. This porridge was not a delicacy, but rather fuel to endure long workdays. Interestingly, to this day, many athletes turn to oats for the constant energy they provide. These cereals were grown in small fields, plowed with human effort and the power of oxen. There were no endless large plantations like we see today. Every bit of land was precious, and the yield of a crop was crucial to the well-being of the village. If there was plenty, the winter would be less cruel. If there was scarcity, the fear of famine silently stalked every home. And there was another curious detail. Fermented barley produced a drink that for the Vikings was more than a pleasure. It was part of social and religious rituals. Mead and barley beer were consumed at feasts, gatherings, and even ceremonies. In a sense, these grains not only nourished the body, but also created community bonds and strengthened traditions. But of course, the farmers' lives weren't limited to large fields. Alongside the crops, small gardens sprang up, offering vegetables, herbs, and spices that supplemented their diet. And it's precisely in these small gardens that we find another fascinating aspect of Viking life. It wasn't enough to plant grain in vast, distant fields. The Vikings also valued small vegetable gardens close to their homes. Their vegetables, roots, and herbs grew, adding a distinctive flavor to simple everyday food. It was almost like having a supermarket at your fingertips, but without the colorful shelves, the rush, and the modernity. A modest space, but extremely important. Gardens were tended primarily by women and children were responsible for keeping the plants alive and productive. Carrots, turnips, cabbage, and even onions were common. Imagine the scene: someone leaving home, harvesting a few turnips, and returning straight to prepare soup over the central fire. Life was practical, uncomplicated, but each spoonful of that broth represented weeks of effort and care. Besides vegetables, there were also medicinal herbs and spices, which transformed repetitive meals into richer experiences. Parsley, dill, and even garlic were used to add flavor and even treat minor bodily ailments. Isn't it curious to think that even today, many families keep spice jars in the kitchen? What we call a hobby or decoration for them was a matter of survival. Vegetable gardens also had a symbolic role. Being close to home meant closeness to family and security. While larger fields required collective labor and travel, the garden brought a sense of immediate control. There was a reserve of food, always accessible. It was a way to balance the effort of the field with the practicality of the backyard. Interestingly, this Viking habit resonates to this day, particularly in the urban gardening movement. Many people in big cities are returning to gardening in small spaces, like balconies and backyards, precisely to reconnect with the lands, almost an instinctive response to the fast pace of modern life. A reminder that, deep down, we still carry this need to plant and harvest. But Viking farmers didn't live on vegetable gardens and grain alone. Their livelihood also included animals, which provided strength, milk, meat, and even leather. And when we look at livestock farming, we learn even more about the heart of rural life at that time. In the life of a Viking farmer, cattle were not just a resource, they were a true pillar of survival. Cows provided the milk that sustained families, turned into butter and cheese to last beyond the seasons. Their hides were used for clothing, shoes, and even everyday objects. And perhaps most importantly, oxen were the power that powered the heavy plow in the fields. Fresh milk was consumed daily, but not only that, it was churned into butter or left to ferment into a type of curd. Imagine waking up to a bowl of slightly sour milk, not by choice, but because refrigeration didn't exist. And yet, it was considered a nutritious food, essential for maintaining energy during long workdays. Leather, in turn, had an almost strategic value. It was used to protect feet on rough terrain, to line boats, and even to reinforce shields. Unlike today, where many people have dozens of shoes, back then, a pair of leather boots could last someone for years. They were carefully cared for, repaired repeatedly, to the point of exhaustion. This contrast demonstrates how each material carried weight and real importance. Oxen were already indispensable in the fields. With their strength, they pulled the wooden plows that cut through the hard northern soil. Without them, agriculture would be even more limited. It's like comparing someone plowing with a hoe for hours with someone relying on the help of robust animals. The yield would change completely. Today, our modern oxen or tractors, but the logic remains the same: technology multiplying human capacity. Furthermore, livestock had a social dimension. Owning animals was a sign of prosperity. A family with good livestock was respected and had a better chance of making it through the winter safely. Poorer families with few animals lived under constant risk of scarcity. It was a silent difference, but one that shaped hierarchies within the village. But cattle weren't the Vikings' only companions. Sheep and goats also played essential roles, providing wool, milk, and meat, and completing the mosaic of rural life at that time. Among all the animals, sheep and goats occupied a special place in Viking villages. They didn't require as much care as larger cattle and provided constant benefits: wool for clothing, milk for food, and occasionally meat to supplement the diet. Anyone who has lived with these animals knows that they bring movement and even a certain characteristic noise, like a musical backdrop to everyday life. Sheep's wool was spun into thick threads, spun by women, and used to weave heavy cloaks. These cloaks were a defense against the relentless cold of the Nordic winter. Imagine wearing a handmade garment, knowing that every stitch was woven over entire nights by the dim light of a fire. The value lay not only in the material, but in the time and care invested in each part of the garment. Goats were seen as hardy, adaptable, and extremely useful animals. They produced milk easily, often even more than cows during certain seasons. This milk could be turned into intensely flavored cheeses that sustained entire families during lean months. In some villages, goats were practically a poor man's cow, accessible to those who couldn't afford livestock. Beyond the practical aspect, these animals also brought a sense of security. Owning sheep and goats meant having an ever available reserve of resources without relying solely on harvesting or hunting. It was like having a living savings account renewed with each generation of offspring. Today, when someone talks about investing in assets, they may not realize that in the past, assets were literally made of flesh and blood. Living with these animals also shaped social life. Children learned early on to herd them, running through the fields and tending the flocks with small staffs. This daily contact instilled responsibility from an early age. Who hasn't heard the saying, "Those who care for little deserve much"? Among the Vikings, this idea was applied in practice. But there was something even more fundamental. These animals, along with cattle, only made sense because there were those who organized their strength for agriculture. And that's where the role of oxen comes in, pulling the rudimentary plow, a key part of Viking subsistence. The plow, back then, was not a shiny metal machine, but a simple wooden structure, heavy and limited. Yet it was the instrument that made the Vikings' agricultural life possible. Pulled by strong oxen, it scratched the hard earth, making space for the seeds that would later sustain entire families. The rhythmic sound of the plow cutting through the soil mingled with the lowing of the animals, creating the soundtrack to each planting. It wasn't quick or easy work. The farmer walked steadily behind the plow, balancing the weight of the implement, while the oxen advanced slowly. The Nordic soil, full of rocks and roots, often impeded progress. It was necessary to stop, remove obstacles, and start again. It was a routine of patience and persistence, with no shortcuts. Today we press a button on a tractor and see hectares finished in minutes, but back then, every meter plowed was an achievement. This effort created an almost intimate connection between man, animal, and land. The farmer depended on the strength of the oxen, but also on his own body, which had to endure hours of exertion. Calloused hands, sweat dripping down the face, and the smell of freshly dug earth were all part of the experience. It's curious how these details, so exhausting at the time, would now be romanticized as a sign of a simple, natural life. And there was symbolism in this activity. Plowing the land not only prepared food, but also reaffirmed the village's continuity. Each furrow open represented the promise of bread and porridge on the table throughout the winter. Perhaps for this reason, many peoples viewed the act of planting as sacred, a silent pact between man and nature. The Vikings were no different in this regard. It's interesting to think that the same spirit can be applied in other contexts today. When someone dedicates themselves to building something from scratch, be it a project, a business, or even a personal habit, they are, in a sense, plowing their own land. The beginning is difficult, slow, and full of obstacles, but with persistence, the fruits appear. The plow, in this sense, is a living metaphor for any journey that requires constant effort. But if fieldwork was so demanding on the body and mind, there was also an inevitable consequence: physical fatigue and accumulated wear and tear. And that's precisely where the repetitive and tiring daily routine came in, shaping the life of every Viking farmer. The day in the fields always seemed the same. Wake up early, walk to the land, plow, plant, tend the animals, harvest. There were no big surprises, just the cycle repeated until it became part of the body and mind. The Viking farmer didn't have the option of inventing fashion. His life depended on this consistency. Anyone who has worked repetitive manual tasks knows how time seems to drag on, but also how each repetition creates its own rhythm. This often grueling pace shaped character. Imagine spending hours bent over the soil, pulling weeds, day after day, or raking in heavy bales of hay, knowing that winter would demand even more. It was exhausting, yes, but it was also inevitable. Unlike today, where one can change careers or seek alternatives, the farmer had no choice: either work nonstop or go hungry. Repetition, however, also brought about something curious, a kind of trance. The body acted alone, while the mind lost itself in thought. Perhaps for this reason, many historians believe that the habit of telling stories and singing songs arose from these moments. Repetition opened space for the imagination. It's like when someone today washes the dishes or drives in traffic and suddenly an unexpected idea struck. Physical fatigue was constant. Aching shoulders, cracked hands, injured feet. Every detail of the body told the story of the hard routine, but there was a certain pride in bearing this weight. The effort was visible, and in the village, being recognized as a hard worker meant respect. Today, when someone speaks of carrying the world on one's shoulders, figuratively, they may not even realize that the Vikings actually lived this in practice. This endless work also taught something that remains valid today: the value of preparation and discipline. There were no shortcuts, no prolonged rest. The rewards came slowly in harvested grain, strong animals, and full barns. It's the same logic we see when someone studies for years for a profession or trains for months for a marathon. Results only appear after countless repetitions. And of course, all this physical exertion had a specific purpose: to secure reserves for the winter. That's why, among so many repetitive tasks, one stood out as the most important of all: harvesting and storing hay, without which no animal would survive the months of intense cold. If there were one word to sum up the concerns of Viking farmers, it would be hay. It was hay that provided food for their livestock during the months when the ground was frozen and nothing grew. Without enough hay, cows, goats, and sheep died, and without animals there was no milk, leather, wool, or labor force. Thus, hay harvesting became almost an obsession. During the summer, the fields were carefully cut and left to dry in the sun. The smell of fresh hay wafted through the village, marking the rhythm of the season. It was a collective effort in which everyone, even children, participated. Haystacks were accumulated in wooden barns, and each stack represented additional days of survival during the winter. Today, we store food in the pantry or freezer, but to them, each bale of hay was equivalent to a full shelf. Storage required strategy. If the hay was poorly stored and allowed to rot in the damp, all the effort was wasted. Therefore, care was taken to stack, cover, and protect each bundle. It was like a high risk investment. Months of work could be wasted by a simple oversight. This constant tension was part of the farmers' lives, and it's easy to imagine their relief upon seeing the barn full and well protected. This dependence on hay also shaped social relations. More prosperous families with large reserves were respected, while those who failed lived under the threat of asking their neighbors for help. This balance between abundance and scarcity constantly reminded them that the community was interdependent. It's curious how this resembles the modern concept of support networks. When one fails, the other steps in. And oddly enough, even moments of rest were affected by hay. During the winter, entire families slept in houses where the sweet smell of stored bales mingled with the smoke from the fire. This aroma became part of the collective memory, a reminder of safety and struggle. It's interesting to think about how smells mark eras, just as today we associate the aroma of fresh coffee with a comfortable awakening. They saw hay as a symbol of survival. But hay, vital as it was, wasn't directly human food. For farmers, what sustained their bodies daily were simple meals of porridge and dark breads made from the grains harvested throughout the seasons. At the Viking table, there was no abundance of varied dishes or banquet-worthy luxuries. The staple diet was simple: warm porridge and dark, heavy breads made from grains like rye and barley. These foods were the fuel that sustained long hours of work in the cold. Each meal was less about pleasure and more about necessity. It was eating to live, not living to eat. Porridge was almost ubiquitous. Made with oats or barley, slowly cooked in clay pots, it was served from breakfast until the last meal of the day. Sometimes they enriched the mixture with milk, honey, or some dried fruit, but for the most part it was a food without seasoning or surprises. For them, a warm bowl of porridge provided enough energy to face the burden of daily life. Dark, dense, and hard bread was made from grains ground in stone mills, mixed with water, and baked in rustic ovens or even on heated stones. Unlike the soft, fluffy bread we know today, this bread was heavy, almost a compact block, but extremely nutritious. One slice could sustain you for hours, essential in a place where the body expended energy just to endure the cold. This type of diet shaped the palate. Those who grew up eating plain porridge and stale bread learned to appreciate small additions: a little fresh butter, a handful of herbs, a sip of milk fresh from the cow. These were details that transformed an ordinary meal into a small luxury. Today, in contrast, we have so much access to varied flavors that we tend to forget the value of something basic and nutritious. Interestingly, this habit of always eating the same thing also had a practical side. It saved time and energy. There were no long discussions about what to prepare or eat. The eating routine was predictable, and this, in a way, provided security. It's like someone today adopting a repetitive diet to focus on other areas of life. The difference is that, for the Vikings, there was no choice. It was the only way to survive. But the sea, with its bounty, brought variety to the table. And that's precisely where another fundamental element of the Viking diet comes in: fish caught in the rivers and fjords that surrounded the villages. If grains sustained the body, Fish brought variety and relief to the Viking farmers' diet. Rivers, lakes, and fjords were everywhere, offering cod, herring, salmon, and even trout. Fishing was an indispensable part of their routine, almost as important as farming. The salty smell of the sea, the creak of wooden boats, and the crash of the waves made up the daily scene for those who depended on the water. Fishing was not a relaxing pastime, but a vital necessity. Men set out in small boats, braving the icy wind and sometimes taking serious risks. Each net cast into the fjord carried with it the hope of returning home with enough food for the entire family. Anyone who has ever waited anxiously for the results of a job knows all too well this mixture of uncertainty and expectation. Fresh fish were consumed immediately, but most needed to be preserved to last for months. Salting, sun drying, or smoking were common techniques. Imagine hanging whole fillets in wooden huts, with the smoke permeating each piece until they became hard as rock. This fish, even dried out, provided sustenance when nothing else was available. Salt, however, was expensive and difficult to obtain, making the preservation process even more precious. Having salted fish stored was a sign of organization and moderate wealth. The poorest, however, depended on what they could consume immediately. This detail shows how even fishing reflected social differences in the village, reinforcing how survival was not equal for everyone. Interestingly, fish also played a role in cultural integration. Festivals and gatherings were filled with fish prepared in various ways when there was abundance. It's fascinating to think that in the 21st century, cod is still a traditional dish in Nordic countries, and even in Portugal and Brazil, as if it were a silent legacy of this ancient custom. But while fish was essential, it wasn't enough to sustain daily energy. There were special occasions when meat was included on the table, almost like a rare treat. And this is where we come to the next aspect of Viking life: meat, usually salted or smoked, which supplemented the basic diet. Meat wasn't abundant at the Viking table, contrary to what one might imagine when thinking of strong warriors and grand feasts. In everyday life, meat was rare. When it did appear, it came in small quantities, almost always preserved in some way. Salting or smoking was a way to extend the shelf life of food, ensuring it would last through the harsh winter. It was more of a survival tool than a feast. The flavor of salted meat was strong, often even unpleasant for those accustomed to today's fresh meats. But for the Vikings, this taste was associated with the security of having something to chew on when the fields were covered in snow. Smoking, in addition to preserving food, impregnated the food with the smell of burning wood, creating a characteristic aroma almost always present in the village houses. Slaughtering animals was not a decision made lightly. Each head of cattle, goat, or sheep had ongoing value in milk, wool, or labor. Therefore, meat was reserved for special occasions, such as religious festivals, community gatherings, or sacrifices in honor of the gods. In these situations, meat consumption became a collective event, charged with meaning. Anyone who's ever saved a chocolate bar for a special occasion understands this logic. The difference is that in the case of the Vikings, chocolate was a piece of smoked meat capable of bringing energy and joy to an entire family. This contrast shows us how the perception of luxury is shaped by circumstances. Today, with supermarkets readily available, meat has become a commonplace item, but back then, it was a true treasure. The way it was prepared also reflected practicality. Simple cuts were cooked in cauldrons with vegetables or eaten in hard, salty chunks. No elaborate seasonings, just the essentials to stave off hunger. It's curious to think how, even amidst scarcity, they found ways to cherish the moment of eating meat, transforming the meal into a celebration. But if meat was scarce, daily life was sustained by another kind of care: women's labor within the household, responsible for turning milk into butter and cheese, and keeping the food cycle going. And this is precisely where we enter the next aspect of Viking life. Inside Viking homes, while the men spent hours in the fields or fishing, the women kept the heart of domestic life beating. They not only cooked and cared for the children, but also ensured the milk was turned into butter, cheese, and curd. This silent work sustained the family as much as plowing the fields. It was there, between the blazing fire and the clay pots, that survival truly took shape. Dairy production was almost an art. Fresh milk had to be churned into butter, a long and repetitive process. Cheese required even more patience: boiling, curdling, draining, pressing. There were no machines, just rustic utensils and skilled hands. Imagine dedicating hours a day to stirring a heavy mixture, knowing that each piece of cheese could mean the difference between starvation and surviving the winter. Furthermore, women were responsible for preserving these foods, storing butter in wooden or clay containers, protecting cheeses from spoiling quickly. All of this required organization and attention to detail. It was like managing a small strategic pantry where nothing could go to waste. Today we open a refrigerator without thinking, but for them every gesture was calculated. But women's roles didn't stop there. They also spun wool, sewed clothes, repaired objects, and tended the never-ending fire. Women were often the guardians of the home, while men traveled or worked outside the home. This centrality gave them respect and a voice within the community, even in a world so associated with male power. Interestingly, this role of invisible providers resonates to this day. How often does the effort of those who take care of the household go unnoticed? Among the Vikings, although recognition was greater, the feeling was the same. Without this work, the machinery would grind to a halt. It's as if the home were a fortress, and the woman, the engineer responsible for keeping it standing. And within this routine of care, there was also an almost daily practice: baking dark breads in stone or clay ovens, which filled the house with the distinctive aroma of toasted grains. This detail brings us to the next aspect of Viking life. In Viking villages, bread didn't come from bakeries lined with display cases, but from makeshift ovens, molded from clay or heated with glowing stones. It was a slow, artisanal process that involved patience and repetition. Women mixed rye or barley flour with water, sometimes a little honey, and shaped flat, heavy loaves that sustained the family for days. The smell of baking bread mingled with the constant smoke from the central fire, creating a unique atmosphere. These ovens were often built inside the house itself, close to the main fire. There was also the practice of baking directly on heated stones, which gave the bread a firm, almost burnt crust, but full of flavor. It wasn't the fluffy bread we know today, but dense, resistant, and nutritious. A single piece was enough to sustain hours of hard work in the fields. The act of baking bread went beyond nutrition. It also had social value. Fresh bread was divided among family members, and at larger gatherings, shared with neighbors and relatives. It was a way to strengthen bonds, and in a way, celebrate collective effort. It's curious to think that even today, bread remains a symbol of unity, present on family tables across all cultures. Furthermore, there was an aspect of learning passed down from generation to generation. Girls watched their mothers kneading dough, measuring the oven temperature by hand, and adjusting baking times without a watch. It was knowledge transmitted by sight, touch, and experience. Today, we rely on timers and written recipes, but back then, it was all memory and practice. This rustic bread, though simple, carried a powerful truth. Life was sustained by the basics. In times of plenty or scarcity, bread was always there, constant, repetitive, reliable. Perhaps that's why, to this day, it symbolizes essential nourishment in so many cultures. But there was one drink that occasionally broke the routine of simplicity: mead, a fermented honey delicacy reserved for special occasions. And it's precisely this drink that brings us to the next topic. Mead held an almost mythical place in Viking life, made from fermented honey, mixed with water and sometimes herbs. It was a rare drink, reserved for special occasions. Mead wasn't found on everyday tables, unlike porridge or brown bread. It appeared at celebrations, weddings, religious rituals, or community gatherings. Drinking mead was, in a way, participating in something big. Its flavor was sweet, strong, and slightly alcoholic, a stark contrast to such a simple diet. Imagine the impact of taking a warm, sweet sip in a cold, human environment, surrounded by the noise of conversation and the crackling of the fire. It was almost like a gift from the gods, something that took the mind off the weight of routine and brought a flash of unexpected pleasure. Producing mead was no simple task either. Honey was scarce and valuable, often obtained through a laborious collection from wild hives. Turning it into a beverage required patience and care. It wasn't a product for mass consumption, but rather a symbol of status and celebration. Anyone who could offer mead at a gathering was seen as prosperous. This social aspect is perhaps the most fascinating. Mead wasn't just a liquid, it was a memory, it was a ritual. People gathered, sang, told stories, and the mead passed from hand to hand. It was like sealing an invisible connection between the participants. Today, we experience something similar when we toast with champagne on special occasions. The act isn't just about drinking, but about celebrating together. And there was also a mythical dimension associated with mead. In the sagas, it appears as a drink of gods and heroes, linked to wisdom and inspiration. Thus, drinking mead, even in small quantities, carried a symbolism that went beyond its flavor. It was almost like touching, for a moment, the divine world. But Viking life wasn't all about celebrations. After the festive moments, routine always took its toll. Rest was short, and work soon began again, reminding us that breaks of pleasure were rare, given the hardships of everyday life. In the Viking village, rest wasn't a luxury, it was merely a short pause between one exertion and another. After long hours in the fields, tending animals or preparing food, the body craved rest, but the mind knew the cycle would soon begin again. Rest was fragmented, stolen in small moments. A nap by the fire, a few minutes sitting on a wooden bench, or the deep, deep of the night, interrupted by the cold and the noises of the house. The bed wasn't soft. Often, it consisted of just wooden benches covered with furs or straw. The body would wake up aching, but there was no room for complaint. The luxury of a soft mattress and a down pillow, so common today, would have been unthinkable back then. The feeling of comfort came less from lying down and more from the simple fact of being alive to rest. Constant work left no room for laziness. If anyone rested more than necessary, the risk was great: missing field time, delaying harvest, and compromising winter food supplies. It's curious how this logic echoes the saying, time is money, but there it was even more radical. Time was literally survival. An extra minute in bed could mean an empty plate months later. And yet, there was something powerful about this brief rest. It was so valued that even short, it seemed to invigorate. Perhaps because the body knew there was no choice to rest enough to endure another day and nothing today, when we have the option of long hours of sleep or moments of leisure, we may not realize the privilege of being able to choose. This cycle of little rest and much work also shaped the village's character. People were trained from an early age to bear the weight of repetition and exhaustion. Children grew up observing parents who never stopped. This fostered a mindset of resilience, of knowing how to cope with discomfort, something that in some ways is lacking in modern comfort. But this brief respite only made sense because there was a specific place for it to take place. The simple, rustic Viking home built of wood, clay, and turf. And it's precisely to this shelter that the next topic takes us. Viking homes weren't grand gilded halls as they appear in films, but modest constructions built from available materials: wood from the forests, clay dug from the ground, and blocks of peat. That thick grass with soil attached to its roots were combined to build thick walls that protected against the icy wind. The result was a simple yet incredibly functional home in the harsh climate. Wood formed the structure, while clay filled the gaps, keeping the cold out. Peat, stacked in blocks, acted as a natural insulator, keeping the heat in. It was as if nature itself had provided bricks, adapted to withstand the Scandinavian winter. It wasn't pretty in the modern sense, but it was efficient, and after all, efficiency was the key to survival. The interior was dark, lit only by the central fireplace and small openings that allowed smoke to escape. Imagine living in a space where the smell of smoke permeated your clothes, walls, and hair, yet at the same time, that same fire was the only guarantee of warmth and light. It's interesting to think that for them, the discomfort of the smell was an insignificant detail compared to the safety from the cold. These homes were shared by the entire family and often by smaller animals, such as goats or sheep, who would stay in a corner during the winter. Their body heat helped warm the space. Today, sharing a home with animals may seem strange, but for them, it was a survival strategy, a reminder that comfort is always relative to context. Despite their simplicity, attention to detail was also paid. Some houses had discreet carved wood decorations, demonstrating that even amidst the daily struggle, there was room for beauty. It was as if they wanted to remind us that life wasn't just about work and endurance, but also about identity and pride. After all, even in a small village, each home bore the mark of the family that inhabited it. And within this rustic space, the heart beat around an indispensable element: the fire in the center of the house, which illuminated, warmed, and brought everyone together on long winter nights. At the heart of every Viking home was a fire, not only a source of warmth, but also a symbol of life. It burned day and night, fueled by firewood brought from the nearby forests. Without it, the cold invaded, food was uncooked, and darkness reigned. More than an architectural detail, it was the soul of the home, gathering everyone around its flickering flame. The fire glowed faintly, casting dancing shadows on the wood and turf walls. The nights were long, and that orange light became the only beacon amidst the darkness. Imagine sitting beside it, listening to the crackle of the logs, feeling the warmth spread through your body, while the wind outside howled against the house. It was a scene of safety amidst the hostility of nature. But fire wasn't just for heating, it was also a kitchen, oven, and lamp. Clay pots boiled over the flames, filling the room with the smell of porridge, broth, or smoked meat. The ashes were used in many ways, including cleaning and preserving food. It was multifunctional, long before that term became fashionable. There was also a spiritual aspect. Fire was seen as something sacred, connected to the gods and the family's destiny. Going out meant bad luck, even misfortune. Therefore, keeping it lit was an essential task, often entrusted to women who became guardians of the flame. It's curious how, in so many cultures, the central fire appears as a symbol of continuity and unity. Around the fire, social life unfolded. Stories were told, songs were sung, children fell asleep, listening to tales of heroes and gods. It was in this circle of light that the village preserved its memory and culture. Today, perhaps, this role is taken over by television or even cell phones, which bring us together around a screen. But in a way, the essence is the same, seeking warmth, light, and connection. And when the night advanced and fatigue set in, the wooden benches and platforms surrounding the fire were transformed into makeshift beds, a place to rest after exhausting days of work. When night fell, there were no soft beds with clean sheets awaiting the Viking farmers. What existed were benches and wooden platforms around the central fire. There, covered in animal skins or straw, men, women, and children lay down to rest. The space was shared, with no privacy, and the collective body heat helped them weather the intense cold of the Nordic nights. Sleeping on these benches was uncomfortable, but habitual. The body grew accustomed to curling up on the hard surface, listening to the crackle of the wood and the crackle of the flame. Often the older ones occupied the seats closest to the fire, while the younger ones sat at the edges where the cold seeped in. This arrangement demonstrated respect and also a logic of natural protection. Sleep was light, often interrupted by noises, the distant lowing of cattle, the wind blowing through the cracks, or even the crying of a child. There was no absolute silence. It was as if life continued to happen around them, even during rest. This fragmented sleep, which today would be considered unhealthy, was for them simply normal. Animal skins provided some relief. Thick and fragrant, they served as both a blanket and a makeshift mattress. Imagine the contrast. Lying on rough leather, inhaling the strong scent of game, instead of the softness of modern fabrics. To us, it seems strange. To them, it was a symbol of safety and survival. After all, each skin worn to sleep represented a victory over the cold. This way of sleeping also shaped the sense of community. Entire families gathered in the same space, sharing warmth, stories, and even dreams. There was physical and emotional closeness, a natural intimacy that today is often lost in the abundance of individual rooms and closed doors. There, rest was also a sense of togetherness, and upon waking, the first thing to do was to put on the heavy, rough, and resistant wool and leather clothes that protected against the cold and allowed them to face another day in the field. In Viking life, clothing wasn't a matter of style, but of survival. Clothing was made primarily of thick wool, obtained from the village sheep, and leather, obtained from cattle and hunted animals. Wool protected against the constant cold, while leather reinforced areas prone to wear, such as shoes, belts, and cloaks. Each piece was designed to withstand the elements in harsh climates, not to please the eye. Women spun wool into long strands, which were then woven into heavy cloaks, tunics, and simple trousers. There were no machines, just skilled hands and hand operated spin. The repetitive sound of the spinning wheel, the smell of freshly sheared wool, and the time spent spinning each strand were part of daily life. It was a slow but essential process, for without proper clothing, no one would survive the Scandinavian winter. Leather, in turn, had multiple uses. Thick boots protected feet from the wet, rocky ground. Leather capes helped on rainy days, and even rudimentary gloves were made for heavy work. Unlike today, when we discard clothing easily, each piece was repaired countless times. Reinforced seams and patches were signs of care, not neglect. Interestingly, the appearance of these garments conveyed status. Fabrics dyed in rare colors, such as blue or intense red, were a luxury accessible only to the wealthy. Peasants, on the other hand, wore more neutral tones derived from the natural color of wool or simple pigments, such as browns and grays. It was possible to tell who had more resources just by looking. These clothes, despite their rusticity, shaped the Vikings' identity. They spoke of practicality, endurance, and adaptation. Wearing thick wool and leather was not only physical protection, but also a reflection of how each family organized itself around available resources. And deep down, there was even a certain pride in knowing that everything was made by hand. And when winter arrived in full force, heavy clothing became even more essential. It was time to don thick cloaks, layer up, and brave temperatures that required not only courage, but constant preparation. When winter set in across the Nordic lands, there was no room for carelessness. The icy wind cut through the skin like invisible blades, and the snow accumulated in thick layers, transforming the world into a silent white desert. During these months, heavy cloaks became as indispensable as food itself. They allowed the farmer to leave his home, tend his livestock, gather firewood, or simply survive the relentless cold. These cloaks were made of thick wool, spun in thick layers, often lined with animal skins for added protection. Imagine wearing something that weighs almost as much as a modern blanket and carrying it around on your body all day. It wasn't comfortable, but it was necessary. Each fold of wool helped trap heat, creating a barrier against the freezing wind. The cloak was also a status symbol. The more elaborate the fabric, the more leather ornaments or metal buckles it had, the higher a person's standing within the community. For farmers, however, the priority was not appearance, but efficiency. A well made cloak could last for years and become a family heirloom, passed down from father to son as proof of endurance. And there was an almost emotional connection to these pieces. The cloak wasn't just a garment, it was a companion on journeys through the countryside, protection on stormy nights, and even a blanket for sleeping. It carried the scent of the hearth's fire, the sheep's wool, the earth, and the sweat of daily labor. Wearing the cloak was, in a way, carrying the entire village with you. Today, when we open a closet full of light and heavy coats for different occasions, it might be hard to imagine relying on a single item of clothing for everything. But back then, each coat was a true shield against the element. It was what separated the farmer between life and the constant risk of hypothermia. And so, day after day, the weight of the cloak matched the weight of the tasks. For even protected from the cold, the Vikings were not free from monotony. The tasks of the field and the house were repeated, creating an almost unchanging routine over the years. There was something predictable about the life of a Viking farmer. The tasks were practically the same year after year: planting, harvesting, tending the animals, storing hay, preparing the dairy, repairing tools. This repetition wasn't seen as boredom, but as necessity. Each action, repeated thousands of times, guaranteed food for the winter and security for the family. The curious thing is how this routine shaped people. Young people grew up watching their elders, and without needing manuals, learned what to do. It was as if life were a silent school, where learning came through observation and repetition. Anyone who has worked in a manual trade, carpentry, sewing, cooking, knows how gestures become automatic, part of the body. This repetitive cycle also created a sense of stability. Even without major changes, there was comfort in knowing what to expect each season. Today, we live in constant search of novelty, but for them, security lay precisely in repetition. It was like a song with the same rhythm, perhaps monotonous, but predictable enough to provide peace of mind. Of course, this monotony took its toll. The body wore out, the mind grew weary, and time seemed to drag on. Imagine decades without significant change, without new technology, without new working methods. What gave meaning was the certainty that each task, no matter how repetitive, had a vital purpose. The cycle was exhausting, but inevitable. Still, there were small variations that brought freshness to the routine: a good harvest, the birth of an animal, the arrival of a neighbor to help, a story told by the fire. These moments broke the monotony, reminding us that even amidst the repetition, there was room for new things, small but significant. And from an early age, children were immersed in this repetitive world. There was no waiting for adulthood to take on responsibilities. From a young age, they participated in tasks, gradually learning to carry the weight of routine. In the Viking village, childhood wasn't synonymous with free play as we see today. From an early age, children participated in tasks, starting with simple labor: fetching water from the river, carrying firewood, caring for chickens, or helping to watch over smaller animals. These small gestures were seen as a natural part of growing up. To work was to learn, and to learn was to survive. Interestingly, this wasn't seen as a punishment. On the contrary, there was a certain pride in being useful to the family. Imagine a child carrying a bucket of water, stumbling but smiling when he succeeded. Every task, no matter how small, created a sense of responsibility. It was as if life was saying, "You're already part of this machine, and you need to keep moving with it." Of course, there was room for play, but much of it imitated adult work. Boys played at herding animals or pretended to fight like warriors, while girls pretended to spin wool or prepare food. These playful activities were, in fact, training for the future. Learning came naturally. Amidst laughter and responsibility, children also played an important role in caring for smaller animals. Goats, chickens, and even sheepdogs were under their watchful eye. This interaction instilled in them a sense of closeness to nature and, at the same time, discipline. After all, forgetting to feed a hen meant fewer eggs the next day, and this mistake didn't go unnoticed. It's interesting to compare this with today. Today, many children are shielded from responsibilities, but the Vikings saw them as a chance to shape future resilient adults. Perhaps there's a lesson here. Small responsibilities in childhood can teach more about discipline than years of theory. After all, learning from practice always leaves a deeper mark. And as they grew, these children were also encouraged to participate in local assemblies, the famous things where they learned In practice, the community life required not only physical work, but also participation in collective decisions. In Viking life, it wasn't enough to work the fields and care for one's family. There was also the responsibility of participating in local assemblies, known as things. These meetings brought together the community's free men to discuss laws, resolve disputes, and make collective decisions. It was a space for dialogue, but also for power, where each farmer's voice could influence the fate of the village. The thing was not just a courtroom, but a veritable political school. There, the younger generation watched their elders argue, defending their interests and appealing to common justice. Imagine a large outdoor meeting surrounded by the sound of the wind, where every word carried real weight. There were no microphones or rehearsed speeches, but there was authority in the firm voice of someone who knew the hard life of the countryside. Participating in these assemblies was also a form of social recognition. Being present meant having a voice, having the status of a free man. Those who were absent or didn't participate were seen as lacking power or respect. Today, we can compare this to the right to vote or participate in community meetings. The difference is that back then, the decision could determine everything from land disputes to matters of survival. The things also functioned as a space for exchanging information. Farmers from different villages would meet, share news, discuss harvests, enemy attacks, or trade trips. It was, in a way, a connection between worlds that in everyday life remained isolated. The gathering was political, but also social, and there was also an almost ritualistic dimension to these gatherings. Decisions were often made in the name of the gods, with oaths sworn upon sacred symbols. It was as if justice was not only in the hands of men, but also overseen by the deities. This reinforced the sense of order and respect, strengthening community cohesion. But beyond politics and laws, Viking life was deeply marked by spirituality. Rituals and beliefs were present in every aspect of daily life, especially in practices related to the fertility of the land and the hope of good harvests. In the life of a Viking farmer, religion was not distant or abstract, but a direct part of everyday life. Before planting, during harvest, or when slaughtering an animal, rituals were performed in honor of the gods. Small sacrifices, sometimes a little milk, a piece of ad, or even the blood of an animal, were offered to deities like Freyr, linked to fertility and abundance. It was a way to ask for protection and ensure the land would be bountiful. These rituals, though simple, carried enormous meaning. The gesture of raising a bowl of mead to the sky or depositing grains into the soil was a reminder that nature had a will of its own. The farmer might work hard, but he knew that without the favor of the gods, nothing would flourish. It's like when someone today crosses their fingers before an interview or prays for health. The desire for something greater to intercede remains the same. The ceremonies often involved the entire community, around standing stones or small groves considered sacred. Men, women, and children gathered to chant and make offerings. The sound of their voices mingled with the wind, created an almost magical atmosphere. Even in their simplicity, these gatherings strengthened social bonds and gave meaning to the difficulties of daily life. It's interesting to note how deeply religion was linked to agriculture. When the harvests were good, it was a sign that the gods were pleased. When the harvest failed, it was believed that something had been done wrong in the ritual. This view shaped behavior, constantly reminding us that human beings did not have complete control over their destiny. And there was also a dimension of hope. Each ritual carried the promise of a better future. that winter would be less cruel, or that animals would have many offspring. This feeling moved people as much as the discipline of work. Today, we call it faith. For them, it was simply living in harmony with invisible forces. And when night fell after the rituals, it was around the fire that stories and sagas were told, passing on knowledge and tradition from generation to generation. When the work ceased and the silence of the night enveloped the village, a special moment arose, the story circle. Gathered around the fire, men, women, and children listened to the sagas, which blended real events, heroic deeds, and mythical elements. The sound of the wind outside contrasted with the voices that inside the house brought to life gods, warriors, and fantastic creatures. It was a way to keep the collective memory alive. These narratives weren't just distractions, they educated. Children learned about courage, honor, discipline, and cunning by listening to the stories of their ancestors. Imagine growing up hearing about a hero who braved raging seas, or gods who punished human arrogance. Each saga was a lesson disguised as adventure, shaping mindsets without the need for books or schools. The storyteller had a special role. They didn't need to be someone of high rank, but rather someone with the ability to capture attention. The rhythm of their speech, the dramatic pauses, and the hand gestures helped create an immersive atmosphere. It's curious to think that, in a way, this role hasn't disappeared. Today, those who tell stories in videos, books, or films continue to perform this same function. There was also an aspect of community bonding. As the stories were told, people shared simple food or a sip of drink, laughed together, or shared emotion. It was a moment to forget the hardships of daily life for a moment. The flames of the fire illuminated weary faces, and the storytelling created a space of connection that went beyond words. And perhaps most fascinating, these stories have survived the test of time. Many of the sagas told in lost villages still resonate today, recorded in medieval manuscripts or recreated in films and television series. Proof that, even amid the harshness of Viking life, imagination had its place. But as magical as the stories were, daily life remained limited. Social life was almost always restricted to the village and close relatives, which brings us to the next aspect of this routine, so marked by proximity and repetition. In the daily lives of Viking farmers, social circles were small. Life revolved around immediate family, close neighbors, and occasionally distant relatives who dropped by for rare visits. There were no large cities or bustling gatherings. The village was the world. This limited community created a network of intense interaction where everyone knew each other intimately. Proximity had its advantages. There was constant cooperation. People helped build houses, shared tools, or shared food in times of need. This community spirit was vital, as survival depended on unity. Imagine relying on the same group of people to get through the harshest winters. Bonds of trust formed naturally. But this close coexistence also generated tensions. Family quarrels or disputes between neighbors couldn't simply be ignored. Since everyone continued to live side by side, it was necessary to learn to deal with differences, negotiate, and often swallow one's pride. Isolation forced coexistence, something we often avoid today by changing environments. Celebrations reinforced this sense of community. Weddings, successful harvests, or religious ceremonies brought everyone together around music, food, and drink. These were moments when the entire village felt part of something greater. There was no external audience, no audience. It was always the same faces, repeating rituals of belonging. It's curious to compare it with life today. Today we have access to global interactions in seconds, but we often lack that depth in our bonds. For the Vikings, every relationship carried real weight because there was no option for replacement. It was a small world, but an extremely solid one. And perhaps because of this social constraint, few farmers ventured on long journeys. Their routine kept them rooted, and leaving the village for long periods was rare, reserved for the few. Unlike the popular image of the Vikings as fearless seafarers, the reality of farmers was much more restricted. For them, long journeys were rare, almost non-existent. Routine kept them tied to the land, their livestock, and their crops. The duty to provide food for their families trumped any desire for adventure. While a few warriors and merchants explored the world, most remained in the village. Transportation was limited. Walking for hours to a neighboring village was already considered a great journey. Boats existed, yes, but not everyone had access to them, much less the resources for long expeditions. The simple act of crossing a fjord could involve enormous effort. It's curious to think how today we cross continents in a few hours by plane, while for them, crossing a region was already a memorable experience. This rootedness also reinforced his attachment to the land. The farmer knew every patch of field, every bend in the river, every trail through the forest. That small portion of the world was enough for his entire life. The sense of belonging was deep, almost visceral. There was no need to seek distant horizons because the challenge was already there, surviving day after day. Of course, there were occasional exceptions. Some farmers accompanied expeditions as rowers or helpers, but they were few and far between. The prolonged absence of a male member of the family could jeopardize the crops, livestock, and even the safety of the home. This made every decision to travel a risky one. It was like abandoning an entire business operating alone for months, simply unfeasible for most. This rooted life may seem limited to our modern eyes, accustomed to constant change and displacement. But for them, there was a wisdom in accepting the place life had given them. It was there, in that small village, that everything happened: birth, work, love, celebrations, and death. A closed cycle, but sufficient. And within this cycle, there was always a greater purpose: to endure the winter. More than planting, fishing, or traveling, the ultimate goal of every Viking farmer was simple and powerful: to ensure the family survived the cold months until spring arrived. In the life of a Viking farmer, every effort, every task, and every sacrifice had one central purpose: to survive the winter. The warmer seasons were merely preparation: planting, harvesting, drying fish, storing hay, making butter, sewing clothes. Everything was done with an eye toward the months of cold and darkness. Winter wasn't just a season, it was a constant enemy, returning year after year. The arrival of winter changed the routine of the entire village. The wind howled in the cracks of houses, snow blanketed the fields, and darkness stretched for long hours. It was during this time that the barns and storerooms revealed whether the year's work had been enough. The smell of hay, the taste of smoked meat, and the warmth of the fire were daily reminders that survival depended on advanced preparation. There was a psychological toll, too. Living for months in a closed, dark, and silent environment required resilience. The stories told at night and religious rituals helped maintain hope. It was as if the entire village breathed in unison, awaiting the spring thaw, as if hoping for a miracle. Today, we speak of difficult seasons, metaphorically, but for them, hardship had a real smell, sound, and Surviving winter didn't just mean physical endurance, but also maintaining social cohesion. Families supported each other, neighbors shared resources when necessary, and any act of solidarity could mean the difference between life and death. This collective awareness strengthened the village bonds, reminding everyone that no one could face winter alone. And when spring finally arrived, bringing the first signs of life in the soil, the feeling was one of rebirth. The village celebrated quietly, not with grand feasts, but with the simple relief of knowing that another cycle had been overcome. And almost without realizing it, preparations for the coming winter began again, because the struggle never truly ended. This eternal new beginning is perhaps the greatest lesson of the Viking farmers. Life wasn't about accumulating achievements, but about enduring life's repetitions with dignity. And it is precisely from this vision that the bridge to the introduction of our itinerary. After experiencing the harsh and repetitive routine of Viking farmers, you might have realized that their lives weren't made up of grand adventures, but rather of small daily battles, getting up early, enduring the cold, repeating tasks, preparing for winter. And if we stop and think about it, our lives, in a way, aren't all that different. What changes are the tools, the comforts, and the choices we have at our disposal. The big question is, what have you been doing with the resources you already have? Aren't we, deep down, wasting more opportunities than they are, even though we have so much? A Viking farmer would do anything to ensure another bowl of porridge on the table. And you, are you making the most of each day, or are you letting time slip away? I want you to reflect. What would you do if you were placed in a Viking village with no electricity, no supermarkets, no internet? Would you resist? This comparison may seem distant, but it reveals something powerful. Your routine, however boring it may seem, can be your greatest survival weapon, and also the key to achieving something great. So, from now on, start valuing your small repetitions, the daily work, the habits that seem insignificant, the cycles you consider monotonous. These are what build long term results. If the Vikings survived the cruelest winter with discipline and consistency, you too can overcome any challenge in your life. And I want to hear from you. Which part of this Viking routine caught your attention the most? Which do you think you could handle, and which would be the hardest? Let me know in the comments. Oh, and of course, if you want to continue exploring these stories that seem boring but hide great lessons, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way you won't miss any content and will follow me on this journey.